for the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. That's our longest underwater oil tunnel, longest in the country. 9,117 feet from end to end. And that's more than twice the length of the span of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. And now we're supposed to call it the Hugh Carey Tunnel after former governor, but no offense to you, I like you, but we'd like to know where we're going. That goes from Brooklyn to the Battery. We're going to keep calling it Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. That's Brooklyn ahead of us. We're going to talk about that on the way back. So let's look at the other end of the tunnel, the southern tip of Manhattan. To your left, the Battery. That clump of trees is Battery Park. Why do we call the southern tip the Battery? Battery of Cannon. Even before the War of 1812. Even back in the colonial days. That's what guns protect the city of New York from attack on the harbor. Oh, and here's another sign of Staten Island side. See the orange boat coming up on your left? Staten Island Ferry takes people from Staten Island Financial District. This boat holds 600, that boat holds 6,000. That's the new model. The old models held 8,000 in cars and buses. Yeah. And when you walk around Lower Manhattan, the financial district, you're walking the streets of that original colonial New York City, a much smaller New York City, about a square mile, but a whole complete city, not just finance. This is what happens with old cities that start small. Once they get on the move, we got to move with the grid plan in 1811. But in 1811, Wall Street was still the center of town, among other things, a residential street. And it's like the center of town starts galloping up the island through the 19th century. And when things move up, they move out. By 1850, not a single person lived on Wall Street anymore, not one. That's the case till the 1990s. When everything moves out, you don't move the money, don't touch the money. The old neighborhood becomes the financial district more by default by design. But here's the catch. Move out, we're half move out, Monday morning, gotta move back. Because finance has always been, still is, the biggest employer in New York City. And all our transit is based on dragging people wherever they move to, back to the old neighborhood, back to work. That's why the big orange boats carry 68,000 people on the cliff to the financial district. Now the newer ferry boats are smaller, so much smaller, but they come from many more locations. They don't go to Pier 11, the Wall Street Pier. And the helicopter's on Pier 6A for tourists. That's a high-end taxi service. But just look at the subway bank. All roads lead to Rome. Most subways lead to the financial district. As a broad range of New Yorkers work here too, you'd be surprised, you'd be shocked to know you saw Rome from that white building in the waterfront there. Yep. That's back more for a company called Solomon Brothers. You want to feel about not working there anymore? Well, better than Solomon Brothers. They're not around anymore. But coming up on the left, see the yellowish building, the setbacks, white accents, a little bit of scaffolding. That's a nice Art Deco building from 1930, but I'm really pointing out because that's on the north side of Wall Street. And we get up there, we're going to see down Wall Street to the end. And remember, Wall Street was the end of New Amsterdam, the Dutch colonial capital city. And that's where the Dutch built a wall, a military wall, along the northern end of the city. And they built that wall primarily to keep out the British. The British up in Connecticut were taking some Dutch land. The Dutch assumed they come for the rest of it. Overland from the north. So they built a wall, beautiful wall, along the northern end of the city and put all their guns there. No guns at the south end facing the harbor, no battery. Because they forgot the British had ships. Well, one day the British ships show up at the south end, they remember their guns, and the Dutch surrendered. They just had to fire a single shot. That's when they took down the wall, made Wall Street, took over New Amsterdam, renamed it New York, and then put their church, Trinity Church, where the wall had been. We're going to see Trinity Church all the way at the end of Wall Street, not the first one. It's where the first one was, but the first one burned down the fire in American Revolution, second one collapsed in snowstorm, 1838, third time's the charm. We're going to see the third Trinity Church from 1846, and you don't want to miss this. It's a cool sight. So all the way at the end of Wall Street, there's an old brownstone church. Look for the church, but look for the cross on the steeple on top, 281 feet above street level. And try to imagine that cross was the highest point in New York City by far, because the rest of the city was only 5 stories tall, and that doesn't get you at the bottom of the steeple. But there's the church, there's the steeple, there's the cross on top, all the way down to the end of Wall Street, Trinity Church. And we kept some old 5-story buildings there at the South Street Seaport from the early 19th century. That's how big the rest of the city was. We didn't know how to build bigger back then, but also back then we didn't use elevators and buildings for people. It wasn't safe for us. That's a natural limit. Let me tell you, you look at the 5th floor and walk up, you forget the nothing, forget the nothing. It's happened to their kids. But at the seaport, you can also see what's bigger. The Waver Tree, that 19th century sailing freighter. The massive sailing ships were much taller than the buildings. The massive sailing ships were so high and impressive, we used to call the masts skyscrapers. It was not until they built buildings tall the ships, you called them skyscraper buildings after the ships. But the first thing about taller ships was not buildings, but the towers of this bridge coming up now. And this is the Brooklyn Bridge, the first bridge built over the East River. This opens in 1883, which is pretty late in the day for your first bridge. I mean, that's 100 years after the British Army left. But most of that 100 years were also the busiest port in the world. The East River's full of ships. Remember the Waver Tree, that's how big the ships were. So any bridge that went over the East River had one giant leap, so the skyscraper mass of sailing ships could fit underneath. And no one could build a bridge this long or this high until someone developed something we now take for granted, the steel cable that holds up the Brooklyn Bridge. And the man who mastered steel cable in the mid-19th century, John Augustus Roebling, is the man who designed the Brooklyn Bridge, the longest bridge in the world when it opened, 1,595.5 feet from tower to tower, using steel cable to hold the span, and steel girders built towers taller than any building had been built before. Now you don't see the steel in the towers because building with steel was a new thing. Some people are nervous about new things, so to keep those people calm, the Roman side was best to hide the steel inside stone, even though the new steel was stronger. But the people watched the bridge go up. It took 14 years to build. They saw the steel was working. When the project started, New York City was still a 5-story city. Before the bridge is done, we're building our first skyscraper buildings using steel girders, built taller, steel capable elevators built for people safely. We break through the 5-story limit for the steel technology for its use improved by the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge is what makes this whole city possible. And as time goes on, we learn to trust steel more. Because next up is this blue bridge, the Manhattan Bridge. You can see right through the towers of the Manhattan Bridge. So you might think that can't be as strong as the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, think again. Because I'm doing a tour on a bus, I cannot take the bus over the Brooklyn Bridge. Too heavy, not allowed. Nothing bigger than a van or minibus is allowed over the Brooklyn Bridge. But I can take the Manhattan Bridge. I can just take vans, buses, trucks, double-decker buses, and subway trains to go over the Manhattan Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge, 8% stone, 20% metal. By 1909, the Manhattan Bridge is 8% metal, 20% stone. Less volume as a structure, but more steel, so more strength. And then next up is the Williamsburg Bridge. Okay, by now you probably wonder, how am I supposed to remember the bridges? But the first three are easy. Brooklyn, Manhattan, Williamsburg, BMW. But they're not in order. The Williamsburg Bridge is the second bridge over the East River. That was 20 years after the Brooklyn Bridge. But look, by 1903, we are not hiding the steel anymore. It's out there for all to see. Also, the Williamsburg Bridge is longer than the Brooklyn Bridge. Yes, it took the record by, well, 4.5 feet. They just rounded it up. Okay, that's probably showing off. But it's stronger. And the Williamsburg Bridge can carry trucks and buses and subway trains. Last point is really impressive because in 1903, the subway wasn't running yet, but we knew it was coming. But before we could build the Williamsburg Bridge, there was something about New York City that had to change. And the thing to remember is when we opened the Brooklyn Bridge, it was a bridge between two separate cities. New York was just Manhattan. Brooklyn was its own city. Now New York, just Manhattan, was already in population the biggest city in the country. The bridge plan worked. Brooklyn was the third biggest, over 1 million people then. There's only 10 cities in the U.S. over 1 million people today. That's the problem. These are two major cities, and buildings you choose their major cities, a lot like buildings in two states. And the only way to get the Brooklyn Bridge built, it had to go from City Hall Manhattan was then City Hall Brooklyn. Not as far, but it's still not. You had to keep the mayors happy. But the people of Manhattan, when the Brooklyn Bridge opened, they looked across the East River and saw something they were not used to seeing. Space. Understand, we had a lot more people living in Manhattan in shorter buildings than now. There's a much more crowded island in those days. For those crowded people who crossed the river and saw spacious places where they could live and still get to work on time. If we build more bridges, but to build more bridges, we're going to have to get rid of at least one of the mayors. And it's all the consequence. For 15 years as the Brooklyn Bridge opened, we had the act of consolidation where New York City goes from just Manhattan to 5 boroughs, taking over Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, all at the same time. Because at that point, there were more people living in Manhattan, the smallest of the 5 boroughs in area, than those other 4 boroughs put together. And now we're consolidated, and now we can start to build. Starting with the Williamsburg Bridge, which does not go from City Hall to City Hall. And it wasn't about going to Brooklyn. It was all about getting out of the neighborhood at the other end, the Lower East Side, which the age of immigration was the most crowded neighborhood on the planet, more crowded than modern-day Calcutta. They built the Williamsburg Bridge so the overcrowded people on the Lower East Side could escape and take over Brooklyn, and they did. And then we start building bridges and tunnels like crazy. So I mentioned 20 bridges. That new tunnel will be the 23rd tunnel when it's done. But most of these bridges and tunnels to Manhattan were all done the first generation after consolidation. And it works because New York is still the biggest city in the country. We're twice as big as the second biggest city. We just set our record in the last census. 8.8 million people in the 5 boroughs of New York City. But that record's really not thanks to Manhattan. Manhattan's had a rebound in the 21st century. In the 20th century, by design, Manhattan lost more residents who lived then in the city of Seattle. Where'd they go? Not Seattle, no. Brooklyn went from 1.1 million then to 2.8 million now. That's our biggest borough in population, has been since 1930. And ever since then, we'd always say Brooklyn split off and zoned again into the 4th largest city in the United States. And you would still say that. So in the last census, Brooklyn almost made it back to 3rd place. There are only 10,000 people in Chicago. Yeah, you feel that breath in there, Chicago? That's Brooklyn. You smell that breath? That's what real pizza smells like. And this cove on your right is still called the Brooklyn Navy Yard, even though the Navy left in 1966, and the day the Navy left was the last day New York could call itself the biggest port in the world. It's also the day we lost over 100,000 gallons of the Brooklyn Navy Yard that day. Yeah, see, lots of theories about a fiscal crisis less than 10 years later. I'm still waiting for someone to figure out. Losing Fort Stats might have something to do with it. But that's all behind us now, and all in the past. And now you look at Brooklyn, you see we have the new style waterfront, residential buildings, even luxury apartments, where quite frankly, and not long ago, nobody wanted to live. Now it's pretty obvious those shiny glass buildings are luxury apartments, and they are. What's not so obvious when we use the old parts of the waterfront for that same purpose. God care what the sign on that brick structure on your right's telling you. There ain't been no sugar there since 2013. That's when Domino's Sugar left the building. They ceased production of sugars there sometime years before that. When they stopped making sugar, though, that's the first we're not making sugar in this city in the history of New York City, including the Dutch time years. Oh, you know what that sound means? Go back home, tell your friends you're running over the New York subway system, live to tell about it. That's a J train. So that's history. So we landmarked the building. This is when you find out what little landmarking actually means. We kept the bricks. The four outside walls and chimney, that's real. It's over 100 years old. The sign's a knockoff we threw up last year. A couple of years ago, empty shell of a building. We're filling that shell back up. Are you putting a new factory? No, we're putting in luxury apartments. Likewise, you look up the coast, you see some brand new buildings. They were still working on them. The bus was COVID, so we're talking brand new. Shiny glass buildings, obvious luxury apartments, and yes, they are. But you see that long old white building in front of the glass building? That was a factory. That was an envelope factory. One day that folded. We got in when we put in luxury apartments.